4. The general strike launched the first day, May 3rd. General context and build-up, excitement and anticipation. Monday, May 3rd, marked the first day of the general strike, generating widespread enthusiasm among workers. This excitement stemmed from the perceived solidarity of the working class, fueled by the trades union conference's decision. Trust in leadership. The decision-makers at the conference were prominent figures in the trade union movement, known for their generally conservative stances, such as Mr. Bevan, Mr. Thomas, Mr. MacDonald, Mr. Smith, and Mr. Bromley. This lent credibility to the decision as a responsible action, not driven by radical ideologies. Unexpected move. Even the Communist Party, while advocating for unified union action, was caught off guard by the boldness of the decision. It anticipated a more cautious outcome, similar to the one made in July 1925. Immediate worker reactions. Optimism on the ground. Workers across Britain interpreted the decision as a clear commitment to fight wage reductions and employer dominance. Comments like, "Wonderful. They mean to wipe out Black Friday this time," reflected renewed confidence in leadership. Lack of awareness. Most workers were unaware of behind-the-scenes negotiations, where leaders like Thomas and MacDonald were seeking compromises to avoid full commitment to the strike. Challenges in organization. Unpreparedness. The strike began with little preparation from the General Council and union executives. Plans and decisions were largely improvised. Confusion in leadership. The General Council's orders were funneled through individual union executives, leading to conflicting instructions and disorganized local responses. Coordination problems. Local trades councils faced significant challenges in aligning various union efforts. Role of left-wing forces and the Communist Party. Proactive support. The left-wing and Communist Party played a vital role in mitigating organizational chaos, advocating for effective coordination and issuing practical guidance for local councils. Proposed structure. The Communist Party recommended forming councils of action to serve as central bodies for directing strike activities. Key functions included coordinating strike efforts among unions, controlling local propaganda to counter government messaging, managing food supplies and essential services, organizing defense corps to protect strikers and prevent scab labor, establishing relationships with military workers to ensure cooperation, systematizing picket duties to ensure effective blockades, implementation in practice, adoption of recommendations. In many large cities, the Communist Party's recommendations were incorporated due to their practical alignment with immediate needs. Example from Sheffield. Initially, Sheffield's Trades and Labor Council lacked any organizational structure. Despite initial rejection, the Communist Party offered material and logistical support, which was later requested and utilized. Contributions included messengers, speakers, and chalking announcements, alongside assisting with the Council's strike bulletin. Impact of left-wing actions. Filling leadership gaps. By stepping in where the General Council failed, the Communist Party and left-wing forces significantly improved the strike's coordination and operational effectiveness. Case study of Sheffield illustrates how the strike apparatus was gradually built through collective efforts, even in the face of initial resistance from established unions. General Council's actions on May 3rd. Organizational failures. The General Council, unprepared for the strike's logistics, scrambled to establish communication with districts and issue instructions. It lacked a newspaper to communicate with workers, as its strike order also shut down the labor press, e.g., Daily Herald. Only after the government launched the British Gazette did the Council create the British Worker, a censored publication emphasizing loyalty to constitutional norms. Leadership missteps. Leaders like Thomas and MacDonald sought to appease the government in Parliament, issuing denials of revolutionary intent and assurances of constitutional respect. They avoided using Parliament to challenge the government's actions, instead focusing on reassuring the middle class and undermining worker solidarity. Government preparedness. The government declared a state of emergency and activated a pre-planned military and logistical response. London parks like Hyde Park were converted into military centres, and police, special constables, and volunteers, blackleg scabs, were mobilized. The press sympathetic to workers, such as the Workers' Daily, was raided and shut down. Worker response on May 4th. Mass participation. Around 3.5 to 4 million workers went on strike, creating an unprecedented sense of solidarity and collective action. Crowds gathered in town centers, voicing frustration over the strike's limited scope and contradictory instructions. Confusion among workers. Many workers faced contradictory directives, such as some trades striking while others in the same workplace continued working. Cooperative society workers were told to leave work, potentially disrupting food supplies, a move criticized as counterproductive. Challenges to union leadership. Local union officials and strike committees were overwhelmed by workers' demands for clarity and decisive action. Delegations traveled to London to seek clearer instructions and push for an all-out strike policy. Press stoppage. The strike achieved a near-total shutdown of the press, a remarkable feat given the conservatism of unions like the printers. Government and employer counteractions. Propaganda and mobilization. The government monopolized the radio to broadcast anti-strike propaganda and appealed for more volunteers. The Liberal Party, led by Lord Oxford, unanimously backed the government, framing the strike as a threat to societal order. Key observations and themes. Labor leadership's weakness. The reluctance to fully commit to the strike or confront the government politically weakened the movement. Leaders focused more on maintaining middle-class approval than advancing workers' demands. Government strategic advantage. The pre-planned, militarized response ensured the government retained control, projecting strength and readiness. Worker determination versus leadership hesitation. While workers showed immense unity and willingness to fight, leadership indecision and contradictory orders undermined the strike's effectiveness. The strike's larger implications. The strike highlighted class tensions, the fragility of labor leadership, and the government's ability to exploit divisions within the movement. May 5th. Growing momentum and worker police clashes increased participation. More workers joined the strike compared to the previous day. Pickets, especially among transport and railway workers, became more organized. Miners, particularly in mining areas, took on active roles with characteristic thoroughness. Blackleg operations begin. The government initiated blackleg transport services, trams and buses, in London and other cities. Violent clashes occurred in Camberwell, Hammersmith, Chiswick, Glasgow, Leeds, and Edinburgh. Windows were smashed, vehicles damaged, and blackleg workers attacked. Police responded with truncheons, leading to injuries, arrests, and heightened tensions. Crackdown on communists. Saqlat Vala was imprisoned for 2 months for his May Day speech. Scotland Yard intensified raids on the Communist Party offices and local bulletin presses. Despite these efforts, the Communists distributed strike bulletins daily, often using improvised printing methods. Government's propaganda machine. British Gazette amplified fear of civil war, framing the strike as a constitutional threat. Volunteer recruitment intensified, particularly among university students, through social pressure. Failures of labor leadership. The British worker offered restrained encouragement, discouraging militant actions while cooperating with government authorities on maintaining food supplies. Leaders clung to legalistic, non-revolutionary assurances, undermining worker morale and handing control over key resources to the government. May 6th. Government countermeasures and union challenges legal and intimidation tactics. The government promised to protect returning workers from union retaliation. Legal figures like Sir John Simon declared the general strike illegal, threatening union leaders with personal liability for damages. Judge Astbury ruled that union funds could not be used for strike pay in an illegal strike, further undermining union resources. Escalation of blackleg services. In London, buses and tube trains were manned by blacklegs and police, often fortified with wire and boarded windows. Blackleg transport services in the provinces, however, made little headway, with significant resistance from workers and limited success. Disunity among workers. Textile areas and engineering industries were marked by divided participation due to confusing and limited orders. Inconsistent union directives fueled discontent, with some workers striking while others continued working in the same workplaces. Left-wing initiative and resistance. Strong left-wing movements, including the Communist Party and Minority Movement, pressed for an all-out strike and better organization. In places like Glasgow, their efforts forced reluctant union leaders to adopt more robust strike strategies. Failures of leadership. Right-wing union leaders echoed the passive, fold-your-arms policy of the General Council. Poor picket organization led to chaotic melees with police, particularly in Glasgow and Edinburgh, where left-wing initiatives were critical to improving coordination. Themes and observations. Worker determination versus leadership failures. Workers demonstrated solidarity and a willingness to resist, but leadership's lack of preparation and fear of radical action limited the strike's effectiveness. Government strength and propaganda. The government used well-prepared legal, logistical, and propaganda tactics to delegitimize and weaken the strike. Role of left-wing movements. Left-wing activists stepped in where leadership faltered, organizing pickets, strike bulletins, and local councils of action. Their efforts highlighted the potential for greater worker-led initiatives had leadership been more decisive. Clash of strategies. The labor leaders' passive approach contrasted sharply with the government's aggressive countermeasures and the workers' on-the-ground militancy. Communist Party and minority movement actions. Mobilization and messaging. The Communist Party distributed 100,000 copies of its manifesto, urging workers to transform the general strike from a defensive action to a broader revolutionary movement. Key slogans in the manifesto: not a penny off the pay, not a second on the day, nationalization of the mines, without compensation for the coal owners, under workers' control, resignation of the forgery government, formation of a labor government. Practical recommendations included forming councils of action, organizing Workers' Defense Corps to counter the OMS and Fascisti, partnering with cooperative societies to manage food supplies, engaging soldiers to gain their support. Revolutionary intent. The Communist Party warned against limiting the strike to defensive demands, advocating instead for bold, offensive measures to undermine capitalist power structures. General Council's position and struggles. Realization of government rejection. The General Council's initial cooperative approach with the government was ignored. Frustrated, it decided to reassess permits for food transport. Public image and weak appeals. The British worker responded meekly to government actions, questioning, "Is it fair?" The General Council refrained from endorsing peace proposals from religious leaders but highlighted the government's dismissal of these efforts. Religious leaders and peace proposals. Church involvement. The Archbishops of Canterbury and York proposed a 3-point resolution: cancellation of the general strike by the Trades Union Congress, TUC. Government renewal of temporary financial support for the coal industry. Withdrawal of new wage scales by the mine owners. The Society of Friends echoed calls for renewed negotiations. Government's dismissal. The government ignored these proposals, focusing instead on its narrative that the strike brought Britain close to civil war. Worker sentiment and determination. Unyielding resolve. Reports from across the country showed workers remained steadfast in their demand for no wage reductions. The British workers' soft tone contrasted sharply with the strength and clarity of workers' demands. Themes and observations. Divergence in leadership styles. The Communist Party's bold and revolutionary stance sharply contrasted with the General Council's conciliatory and hesitant approach. Religious mediation and government strategy. While religious leaders sought to mediate, the government's focus remained on propaganda and maintaining its dominance. Worker strength versus leadership weakness. Workers demonstrated unity and determination, but leadership inconsistencies and passive strategies hampered the strike's effectiveness. Growing tensions. The government's rejection of negotiations, coupled with its portrayal of the strike as a threat to civil order, heightened tensions across the country. May 8. Government displays power and tightens control show of armed force. A convoy of 140 food lorries, escorted by armored cars, cavalry, and mounted police, was transported from London docks to Hyde Park. This overt military display aimed to intimidate workers and reassure government supporters. Warships and submarines were stationed at docks, and large army battalions were mobilized. Prime Minister's broadcast. The Prime Minister delivered a speech emphasizing his desire for peace while demanding the unconditional end of the strike. Civil Constabulary Reserve. The government established a new force recruited from ex-military personnel to supplement the police and special constables. Members were armed with truncheons, armlets, and steel helmets. Government's grip on food supplies. The government solidified its control over food supplies, bypassing cooperative solutions and using middle-class volunteers to maintain transport services. Labor leadership's response. The General Council continued its conciliatory approach, rejecting financial support from Russian trade unions and returning a check offered as assistance. Right-wing labor leaders, such as Thomas, began private negotiations, further undermining the strike by discussing wage reductions and seeking compromises with government figures like Sir Herbert Samuel. May 9. Rising worker frustration and General Council weakness. Samuel's negotiations. Sir Herbert Samuel, chair of the Coal Commission, resumed discussions with labor leaders, including Thomas, who reportedly met with the king as part of the effort to undermine the strike. These negotiations were kept secret, frustrating workers and eroding their trust in leadership. Worker determination. Across the country, mass meetings demonstrated unwavering worker morale and increasing demands for an all-out strike. Resolutions were passed urging decisive leadership. Women played a prominent role in organizing, fundraising, and distributing literature, working alongside councils of action. Food supply mismanagement. the General Council tightened permits for food and milk distribution, treating cooperative societies the same as private traders. This caused discontent, particularly in northern counties like Northumberland and Durham, where local cooperatives could have taken charge of feeding arrangements. In some districts, like Doncaster, workers overruled General Council instructions and organized mass pickets with cooperatives to control food supplies. This led to clashes with police, who baton-charged workers and arrested over 70. Religious leaders' interventions. The Archbishop of Canterbury and Cardinal Bourne delivered sermons aligning with the government stance, framing the strike as a moral failing and supporting state authority. Government propaganda and repression. Propaganda about civil war and constitutional threats intensified. Pickets faced increasing police interference, and communist organizers were arrested on minimal pretexts. Behind-the-scenes repression plans. Reports indicated that the government was preparing for drastic measures, including arresting union leaders, seizing union funds, and passing emergency legislation to weaken unions. Labor leaders, increasingly nervous, began pressuring miners to accept wage reductions, undermining the unity of the strike. May 10. Leadership's mixed message from the General Council. The British worker published a message from the General Council praising workers' unity, loyalty, and orderly conduct during the first week of the strike. The General Council urged workers to remain firm, follow instructions, and trust your leaders. Government's changing tone. The government's tone softened as it became clear that trade union leaders, through secret negotiations with Sir Herbert Samuel, were prepared to accept terms without consulting the miners. Labor leaders, under pressure from the government, sought to manage worker expectations and avoid expanding the strike. Criticism of leadership. Behind the scenes, labor leaders were accused of betraying workers by negotiating a memorandum with the government while publicly calling for trust and unity. Workers increasingly pressed for an extension of the strike, recognizing that failure to escalate would only strengthen the government's position. May 11. Limited expansion of the strike. Extension of the strike. The General Council announced that from May 11, the strike would include engineering and shipbuilding trades, but notably excluded government dockyards, reflecting hesitancy to provoke further government retaliation. Workers received the instructions enthusiastically, eager to broaden the fight. Worker sentiment. Despite their willingness, workers were frustrated by the leadership's secret diplomacy and perceived betrayal of the miners. May 12. The strike weakens. Government gains momentum. The government's organizational grip tightened as the General Council weakened. The British Gazette grew in circulation, supported by the government's monopolization of paper supplies and logistical resources. Worker spirit versus leadership decline. The spirit of the workers remained strong, with unemployed workers playing a significant role in resisting blacklegs and supporting the strike. However, the General Council's reluctance to escalate the strike left workers increasingly isolated. Key themes and observations. Leadership's contradictory behavior. Publicly, the General Council called for loyalty and patience, while privately engaging in secret negotiations to end the strike under terms unfavorable to the miners. This duplicity eroded trust among workers and highlighted the disconnect between rank-and-file solidarity and leadership priorities. Government strategic strength. The government maintained a clear strategy, monopolizing resources, ramping up propaganda, and steadily increasing its control over essential services and supply chains. Worker resilience. Workers remained resolute and eager to escalate the strike, demonstrating unity and determination despite leadership failings. The involvement of unemployed workers bolstered strike efforts, minimizing blackleg participation. Approach toward the fatal day. The days leading to May 12 highlighted the widening gap between worker resolve and leadership hesitation, setting the stage for the eventual collapse of the strike. The government's systematic and prepared response contrasted sharply with the General Council's disorganized and inconsistent leadership. The surrender. The general strike is called off decision without miners' consent. The General Council decided unanimously to call off the general strike without consulting the miners, leaving them abandoned. A deputation led by Bevan and Purcell unsuccessfully attempted to persuade the miners' executive to accept the Samuel Memorandum, which miners staunchly rejected. Unconditional surrender. At noon on May 12, the strike was officially ended, violating the Trades Union Congress's earlier pledge that all workers would return together under the original terms. The strike was called off based on Sir Herbert Samuel's unofficial conversations and vague promises, with no binding assurances from the government. Correspondence reveals leadership's betrayal. Letters exchanged between Sir Herbert Samuel and the General Council showed Samuel explicitly stated he was acting on his own initiative and lacked government authority. Despite this, the General Council unconditionally ended the strike, relying on vague promises from Prime Minister Baldwin that negotiations would resume. The Samuel Memorandum key provisions: resumption of coal industry negotiations, with a temporary subsidy to support the process. Establishment of a national wages board, including neutral members, to mediate disputes. No immediate wage reductions without assurances of coal industry reorganization. Measures to support displaced workers from uneconomic collieries, including government-assisted relocation. Temporary financial maintenance for unemployed miners. Construction of new housing for transferred workers. Lack of worker involvement. The memorandum was negotiated without consulting workers or miners, prioritizing government and mine owner interests over labor demands. It implicitly allowed wage reductions and compulsory arbitration, directly contradicting earlier pledges by union leaders. Worker reaction and miscommunication misinformed workers. Workers initially believed the strike had ended in victory, leading to organized victory meetings in provincial towns. These meetings quickly turned into bitter gatherings of disappointment and frustration as the truth of the surrender emerged. Feelings of betrayal. Workers who had shown solidarity and risked their livelihoods felt betrayed by union leaders who had called off the strike unconditionally. The events drew comparisons to Black Friday, 1921, though this time the stakes and participation were far greater, involving 3 to 4 million workers. Themes and observations: leadership failures. The General Council's decision was marked by panic, incompetence, and cowardice. It prioritized appeasement over the interests of workers and miners. Leaders ignored their pledges and engaged in secret negotiations, demonstrating a lack of transparency and accountability. Unwavering worker spirit. Workers responded nobly to the strike call, demonstrating solidarity and determination. The abrupt and unconditional end of the strike betrayed their efforts, leaving them demoralized and disillusioned with union leadership. Government strategic victory. The government maintained control throughout the strike, leveraging propaganda, military force, and alternative logistical systems to outmaneuver the unions. Sir Herbert Samuel's role, though unofficial, proved effective in facilitating the government's aims and undermining the strike. Historical impact. The general strike of 1926 ended as a catastrophic defeat for organized labor, exposing deep flaws in union leadership and their inability to effectively challenge entrenched capitalist structures. It became a stark lesson in the need for strategic unity, transparency, and bold leadership in labor movements.